Welcome to a new episode of Riyadh, a podcast about entrepreneurship in the Middle East and North Africa region. I'm Marissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center, and my co-host is Imad Shawa of the Howdy Arabia podcast, tuning in from Amman, Jordan. We continue our focus on the film industry in the MENA region, and today we look at the production side of filmmaking. So we're really excited to be learning more about this from Ali Jaafar, a film producer who currently heads the film division at MBC Studios. He's produced The Swimmers for working title on Netflix, which tells the true story of two sisters who left their home in war-torn Syria for a new life abroad in Europe and had the opportunity to compete in the 2016 Summer Olympics. Other films Ali produced include King of Thieves, starring Sir Michael Caine, and The Idol, which tells the story of Muhammad Assaf, the Palestinian winner of Arab Idol, which was directed by two-time Oscar-nominated Palestinian filmmaker Hani Abu Asad. Ali, what an impressive rollout. So thank you for joining us today and welcome to Riyadh.
Thank you, Marissa. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I guess we are so curious to know a little bit more about how this all started for you. What's your story with filmmaking and movies? Tell us more.
Okay. So I initially was a journalist, and I was covering, I started just kind of doing film reviews and interviews. And I also started covering the actual business of kind of filmmaking and the kind of film and TV industry for a magazine called Variety that was one of the kind of preeminent trade publications going back over 100 years for Hollywood and then the international entertainment business. So through that, I rose to become international editor. And just the access to people, I'd get to interview the most important producers and filmmakers and studio executives. So you create a kind of network of relationships. And I always believed in, respecting the relationship more than the story. And so far, sometimes you get access to a piece of, exclusive information and you can make a big short-term splash, but it's sometimes to the detriment of that individual or the project or the company. So I would generally tend to, play the relationship rather than the story, which then creates a level of trust, obviously, in those people. So when it came to wanting to try to make the switch over, thankfully, I was able to, I had good relationships with a number of people that enabled me to, make that switch over into production. So that's kind of how it first started.
So what does it entail to actually make a switch over to production? Like, how does it all work?
Well, I mean, look, I think ultimately producing in its most crystallized form is two things. It's having an idea, and then it's solving problems. So it's really as simple as that, which is not simple at all insofar as because it's just a daily grind of kind of solving problems, whether it's trying to put a story together with talent and then trying to find the money for it and then getting it into production and then keeping it in production because in production every day there's a million problems. And they only ever call you when there is a problem. So you only ever get bad news. And then you hopefully try and get it through post-production and try and find a home for it in terms of distribution. And you hope that at the end of all of that, the film is worth seeing, which is often not the case because it's been such an effort just to get it over the line. Most movies, for example, on iTunes or on aren't great movies. If you think of the hundreds of movies made a year, maybe a dozen or a couple dozen are kind of good. So you're always facing those odds with any attempt to kind of create something out of nothing. Having said that, the potential benefit and upside of creating a story that is meaningful, that has some kind of commercial life, and also enables you to put very talented people with something to say and give them a platform is ultimately a very attractive one and worth all the headaches and the migraines and the kind of pitfalls.
Sounds like a typical entrepreneurial journey with all the setbacks and the
except there's no money to be made for quite some time, and even up till now,
right.
I think and the kind of stories that I've tended to be to kind of gravitate towards have, obviously being an Arab or someone of Arab origin, but kind of growing up in the West, I've always naturally been, it's where I come from. It's so that I'm always kind of focused on that, whether it was with my writing initially, and also the stories I tell. I tend to gravitate towards. I think it's natural. I don't think it's intentional, but almost accidentally, there's these inspirational, uplifting stories that somehow can change the kind of dialogue about the Arab world. With The Idol, for example, which is the first movie that I produced independently outside of a company. It was kind of my baby. I was just taken from the minute I read the story about Muhammad Asaf, and it's just like, it's a movie. It's a natural movie. This taxi driver, wedding singer in Gaza. He's able to break out somehow. He gets into Egypt. He kind of bluffs his way and hustles his way into the auditions, and then he just blows everyone away. And his journey to the finale just captivates the Arab world. And when he wins, you just have to see the real life footage of Palestinians celebrating, and it's like he won the World Cup. And it really was a victory for a people, not just. And it's just a reality. It's just an entertainment show, but there was something more. There was something symbolic about it. So, being able to put that one together in very difficult circumstances. It was shot all in location in Palestine. We also shot in Gaza for some of the movie. That, and then being able to take that to a global audience and to actually be able to sell the movie. We sold it everywhere. I mean, we sold it to really strong distributors in Europe, in Latin America, North America, in Asia, China. So to be able to get that level of exposure on a story like that is really quite fulfilling, satisfying.
Yeah, I can imagine so. Well, kudos for following your heart with these stories.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of journeys, sorry, Ali, to interrupt you. I met you 15 years ago in London when you were a journalist, and I remember that your parents had moved to the UK, and you actually moved to the UAE. Is that while you were in journalism, or kind of transitioning? And what does the UAE offer someone like you in terms of fiction?
Transitioning means many things these days. No, when I was I moved to Dubai from London because of the production, because of the kind of producing career. Idol had been a co-production with MBC. And whenever an independent producer, I was still in London at the time, whenever an independent producer, finds a source of financing, which I did with MBC, you just start bombarding them with ideas to the point where they're like, look, stop sending us 20 ideas a day. Just come and do this with us from the inside. And at the time, we had 2 young kids. And Maya, my wife, very well. She had family and very good friends in Dubai. So that it was just a perfect kind of situation where, kind of moving to Dubai, a kind of new adventure with a big company like MBC that had great ambitions to kind of take Arabic stories global and really elevate the quality of Arabic stories, both in the region and beyond, was an amazing adventure and an amazing opportunity, and one that has since become even more pronounced since the kind of launch of MBC Studios, where I work, which is the kind of dedicated production distribution arm that really has a big focus on, kind of like I said, trying to correct and certainly change the kind of dialogue and POV on Arabs globally, like I said, inside the Arab world and beyond.
Right.
And I mean, it seems like you got into this right at this like pivotal point for the region to really start turning the page around. And like you said, change the narrative about the people and the region. Or sort of like take ownership of the story. So what did that look like? What does that look like? This this shift? Why are we seeing this?
It's not by design, so I can't take any credit. It's kind of being in the right place at the right time. It's somewhat fortuitous, but you're right that we're in a moment now, and we haven't fully achieved it yet or realized it yet because it's still happening around us, where there are, particularly in the Arab world, a number of kind of dynamics that I think it doesn't mean that we'll succeed, but I think will give us let's say, the soil where there really can be, I think, a boom in the quality and quantity, but really it's the quality that's important of storytelling from the region. And I think there's a number of factors. Obviously, with the switch to digital, with the growth of streamers, if you look at MBC's own kind of SVOD platform, Shahid, which the number one dedicated Arab language digital platform. But you also look at the big global players. Netflix is doing more in the region. You see Disney coming into the region, Apple coming into the region, eventually people like Paramount, etc. So it's just the timing is exciting because it's still somewhat of an undiscovered region, the Arab world. It hasn't yet achieved, for example, the maturity of other foreign language territories like Korea, which is won the Best Picture Oscar and had kind of great success with shows like Squid Game, or if you look at Scandinavia with its TV shows, Italy, Germany, these are all kind of countries and areas who have exported their stories with great success. We haven't yet seen that really in the Arab world, but I think our time is coming if we can tell the right stories in the right way. And on top of that, particularly in terms of cinema, the opening less than 5 years ago of theaters in Saudi Arabia is a game changer. It's a game changer because traditionally, even though the Arab world is 350 million people, which would, on a dollar-for-dollar basis, represent a big territory, if you break it down, 80, 90 million is Egypt, and they only really watch Egyptian. They don't watch other Arabic stuff. So that's a third of your territory out. And then North Africa is another third, and they don't have a huge amount of cinemas. And then you start breaking it down, you then end up in the Gulf. So when your biggest market in the GCC didn't have theaters, didn't have cinemas, then it was always a challenge to make Arabic language movies for a certain budget that could appeal to audiences in their own territory. Somewhere like Korea, for example, was always able to make Korean language movies and find a great audience in Korea. That wasn't the case for non-Egyptian Arabic movies. They always relied upon, co-financing from outside, being somewhat European-facing, festival-friendly movies, which weren't necessarily the movies that audiences in the Arab world wanted to watch. But I think when we now see Saudi is now the second biggest market already in the region, within a year or two, it'll be the biggest market. And we haven't yet seen the kind of premium, let's say, high-quality Saudi and Gulf language kind of movies really hitting audiences. When we do see that, that's a game changer because it means, one, you can increase your budgets locally, you can increase the revenues you expect to make locally, which then allows you to be more daring, more ambitious with the stories you tell. And you hope that one of those stories, and 2 and 3 and 4, then find audiences outside of their territory. For example, Egyptian movies, as successful as they are in Egypt and the Arab world, and right now, the most successful movies in Saudi, alongside the big Hollywood movies, are Egyptian comedies. Those are the ones they make more than most other movies, but they don't travel beyond the Arab world because they are very locally minded. Whereas if we can find stories, if we can find our own Parasite, if we can find our own, Almodovar movies, even one day our own kind of Crouching Tiger, the type of movie that really is of a certain culture, but done in a way that's elevated and done in a way that's accessible, then that's when you start to create your own stars. We haven't had a star, an Arab star, since Omar Sharif, which is insane if you think about it. When you look at other countries, obviously the Spanish, the Italians, the Chinese, and many beyond that, star in Hollywood movies, English language movies, it all helps. It all helps to teach people about your culture. It all helps to teach people about civilization, which then, I think does make a small difference, not a huge difference, but it does make a positive difference towards just the general dialogue between people. and understanding between people. We don't have that. We cling to, okay, now, for example, we're seeing Arab Americans, comedians having success, thankfully, and rightfully having people like Rami, people like Mohammed are having mainstream success, and but it's which is great, but it's still a diaspora story. But we haven't yet had a homegrown, a real, like I said, someone from Lebanon, someone from Egypt, someone from the Gulf, really kind of pop out and become a viable, bankable name internationally. But God willing, that will happen soon.
You just reminded me, Ali, of this survey of Americans about the region a few years ago, and they asked them where a number of countries are, and one of the countries in the survey was Agraba, which is the fictional city, the central location of the movie Aladdin, and many people thought it was a real country in the region. Many Americans.
I'm sure some Arabs thought that too.
Well, I mean, I don't know that, but it's interesting. I mean, that is such a simple fact, right? That realizes this gap, this knowledge gap, right? Gap of perceptions between, North America and the West and the region. So,
I agree. I'd add one point to that too, and it's a kind of an interesting. It's almost like an internal conversation that's taking place, but there's a subtle. I wouldn't say it's a tension, but it's almost like a competition between Arab and Muslim, and by that I mean if you see, for example, in the West, there is success with, let's say, Asian, whether British Asian, American Asian film stars, TV stars. They've had far more success than, let's say, than Arabs, partly because of numbers, but also just that they've done a great job. People like Riz Ahmed have won Oscars, and he's doing amazing work in front of the camera and behind the camera. But you'll notice that there's sometimes a kind of a subtle focus on Muslim representation that tends to overshadow Arab representation. And you'll sometimes find that Muslim focus taking over from the idea of people from this part of the world. So we know that Muslim and Arab is not the same thing, but they can sometimes be conflated, and one gets lost under the other internationally.
Yeah, that's a great point. I liked how you articulated the whole notion of Egyptian cinema, the fact that maybe 90% of Arabic feature films in history have been Egyptian comedies or Egyptian drama, and that they don't travel as much, not even as much as Bollywood or maybe Turkish or even other local cinemas, because you mentioned they don't, they're too local minded.
And that's, by the way, just to be clear, it's not a criticism. It's just they've achieved great success. They have a formula. And by the way, and the same goes for probably one of the top 5 movie stars on the planet. If you look at it globally, is someone like Shah Rukh Khan. Shah Rukh Khan doesn't need to make an English language movie to be a global movie star. He makes his movies in his culture, and he's just a transcendent movie star that around the world, millions, if not billions of people know who he is. So it's not in any way a criticism. It's just that when it comes to, whereas Bollywood films, for example, do find diaspora audiences, and I think it's partly because of numbers, but also, again, it's because of the scale of the movie. If you look at the extravaganza which a 3.5-hour Bollywood movie is, with songs and dance and kind of production values, obviously India is $1 billion plus in terms of a domestic audience. You don't have that. This goes back to the earlier point. You don't have that same domestic audience. The only territory that has a domestic audience that comes anywhere near to rivaling that, obviously on a smaller level, is Egypt, which is why they've thought, okay, I'll just make my movies for Egypt, and the Arabs are used to Egyptian, so they'll watch what I make anyway. But there's never been the idea, you don't see a French couple going to see, let's go check out this Egyptian movie. But they might see a Bollywood
So
movie.
in basic terms, for outsiders from the MENA region, what would be the elements that are different between an Egyptian drama and, let's say, your latest film, Swimmers? Why does that one travel globally? Is it the style? Is it that it's using kind of the cinematic style?
I think, firstly, it's because the most commercial movies in Egypt are comedies. Comedies generally are local. Whether if you look at in Italy, for example, you have every Christmas they have the Christmas. They have one or two of these super local Italian Christmas movies that they crush in the box office. I mean, they beat every movie out there, but no one outside of Italy will ever see them. One of the I think it's the biggest moneymaker, or the second or third biggest moneymaker in French box office history, is a film called Bienvenue les Ch'tis, Welcome to the Sticks, that no one outside of France has ever seen, but it's made more money than every other movie ever released in France. And it's same with Germans. So the comedy, by definition, unless it's one of these globally kind of Hangover or something like that, comedy tends to be very local. And that's why with Egyptian, what succeeds are these comedies. And Egyptians love them and Arabs love them, but the sensibility is so local, there isn't a natural appeal. Now, the odd drama has managed to get out, but not with the regularity that you'd think somewhere with the glorious. If you look back to Egypt in the 50s and 60s, for example, it was the third biggest film industry in the world behind Hollywood and Bollywood. You couldn't say that today.
Wow. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize it was actually the third largest film industry. But since we're on Egypt,
everyone else caught up.
Yeah, absolutely. But speaking of Egypt, so how can the rest of the region sort of learn a little bit from the Egyptian experience, but also move beyond it to where this conversation is going with the amplification of the local narratives to global audiences from the region?
Look, I think in general, without speaking specifically to the Egyptian example, but I think globally, audiences have become far more open and receptive to stories from other cultures. And a large part of that has been thanks to these kind of streaming platforms like Netflix and shows like Money Heist and Squid Game. People have gotten more used to reading subtitles. It's no longer a kind of barrier to their enjoyment. And because of the plethora of content, the sheer volume of content out there, you want something that can stand out and surprise you. So when you've seen the same romantic comedy 25 times, you're not going to watch it a 26th time. But when you're confronted with something where you genuinely don't know where the story is going to go, and it's done in a style that's original and distinctive, you're naturally drawn to that. So that's where I think we need to, as Arabs, focus. And I think we need to tell our stories in the most honest and best way possible, and in being kind of uniquely culturally specific, but being true to that, but doing it in a way which can stand up in terms of production values and quality of script, quality of direction and acting. Do it in a way that stands up to the competition. Then we have something to say, and hopefully they'll listen.
Well, I want to go back to the whole notion of being a producer, just for audiences who are maybe young filmmakers or aspiring producers. How much of it is, if you're not working for a big studio, how much of it is really fundraising and really selling your idea, and how much of it is like project management, or are there different kinds of producing roles?
Look, the most important thing I tell anyone that wants to get into it is forget it's not fun. Don't think of it as this fun, creative, fulfilling role. It's not. It can be that, but it's really problem solving. It's getting up and making sure that you book taxis at 6 a.m. to pick up the cast and the crew. It's making sure that the equipment has arrived on time. It's making sure that you've got the right permit to shoot in a certain place. It's making sure that there's food coming to feed you. I mean, it's that level of project management. And then, okay, if you have the creative idea of, I think this character should do this in that moment, fine, that's a part of it. But you have other people to do that. You have writers and directors. And of course, the best producer is someone that can marry the different elements. But if you don't have the logistical application and the logistical thoroughness, you'll never be a good producer. That's because even though that sounds like the boring bit, that's the hard bit. Just having an idea and saying, "Oh, this script note doesn't," fine. That's anyone can do that. But really, what makes the best producers are the ones who are the most thorough, and the ones who are the most meticulous and the most relentless. Because you'll constantly have setbacks, you'll constantly face obstacles and problems, and so the person that can keep going, somehow find the reason to keep going. And you're always going to have annoying people, because people are annoying, and they're on film sets the most annoying, because everyone thinks they're right, and you have to be the one to prove to everyone they're right while getting the other person's point of view across as well.
Yeah. So Ali, one of the questions that we asked a lot of our guests on this podcast is basically, what is the role of governments in the region, businesses, the private sector, to try to encourage all these different sectors to emerge, but particularly with the film industry?
It's crucial. It's crucial, and you see that, and it's happening. There is now, certainly in the Gulf, there are initiatives and bodies which are really trying to encourage both the bigger productions from outside to come, but also kind of trying to stimulate local filmmakers and storytellers in the region. So it's, and the private sector, ultimately, it's not, there's a reason why it's called private. It's not charity. So it's on us to prove that there's a profitable model and a sustainable model to storytelling, which is why, again, it comes back to, why is it so important that there are now theaters in Saudi? Why is it so important that there are multiple platforms to sell, TV content and film content on digitally in the Middle East? Because that all equates to revenue. So when you go to a private investor and say, please put money into one movie or 5 movies or this series, you need to show them that there's a realistic chance of not just recoupment, but even making a small profit. Now, it's never going to be the same business model as real estate or oil and gas. You can't compete with those levels of return because those are different industries. But at least if you can show it to someone who will have, obviously, additional interest in telling a particular story or supporting a particular filmmaker, or also wanting to be around, creative people, because for them that adds value to their life. You would also want to show that you're not necessarily going to lose money. You might make it back, and you might even make some money, but at the end of it, you'll also have some product which you're proud of, and potentially also helps to, have a positive impact on society and perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we have more time to go into depth. I was thinking about your point about Saudi theaters and how and the number of movie theaters per capita in different markets, and how that really plays a role in things like you mentioned, the commercial aspect of storytelling. Does it turn a profit? Can the private sector get involved?
Look, right now the main commercially viable genre of movie in the Arab world are Egyptian comedies. And by the way, to be very clear, star-led Egyptian comedies. So Tamir Hosni, big names. Now, there is also a belief, and the company I work for, MBC, obviously being a Saudi company, is making a big investment in Saudi content as well as Pan-Arab content. But we do have a belief that if we create quality, high-quality Saudi content, that will also find a big audience, number one in Saudi, of course, but we hope beyond. So that's where I think we might see, or I'd hope to see, a paradigm shift in the next few years, and particularly since the advancement that's happening in Saudi, it's astonishing. It's a different country today than it was even just a few years ago, and you see what the young generation is doing there, men and women. That advance socially and culturally should really, I hope, give rise to some super interesting stories.
Yeah, I mean, again, speaking of Saudi Arabia, since we're on that, I do remember when the movie Wajda came out.
Mm-hmm.
The young girl who, just kept fighting her way to ride a bicycle. And the sociocultural sort of context, I think that actually, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are in terms of viewership, but I do remember, at least in Washington, there was a lot of interest because they had not seen a story like that before.
You're absolutely right. It's a great example, and it's actually an example of what I think would change, because Swajda was primarily financed, not primarily, but was substantially financed with Arab money, but also with kind of European money. That kind of European co-production, festival-led, and it was a festival-led movie that did fantastically well, partly because, Haifa Mansour, the director's story of the first film to shoot in Saudi, and female director, young girl protagonist, it was such an appealing story, and it was such a nice movie. But the movie I want to see now is the Home Alone version of Wajda, because that's the one that I want to see now. Because that kind of festival-ish art house type of movie, isn't your natural bet, successful bet in this region. But doing that kind of a story where the girl is very cheeky and she's kind of doing, it's like Dennis the Menace and doing stuff, and it's making that on an elevated level is, I think, the next step. Going from drama to comedy, from drama to action. That for me is the next step, but still doing it in a classy way, in a way that has something to say. I always said, if you did Beverly Hills Cop, exactly the same movie, in Beirut or Baghdad, it would be seen as an art house movie, just because of the language and the context. But the fact is, it would still be Beverly Hills Cop. It would still be about a wisecracking policeman and a fish out of water. So kind of context and subtext is everything. So for me, the most subversive thing we can do is to tell honest, well-made Arabic stories that do say something about our condition, but do them in a super commercial way so that they're as accessible as possible. And when someone watches them, they will feel a little bit closer to that culture and that society than they were before they watched it.
Let's see. We usually wrap it up by asking what we would recommend, filmmakers in the Arab world. What would you tell them? Any advice you have?
No, look, one, make sure you have a story to tell. A lot of us, I have this thing where someone comes in and pitches a story. I'm like, okay, but wait, think of 3 people. Can you think of 3 people other than your friends and your family that would go out and buy a ticket to see this story on a Tuesday night? And if the answer is no, then you probably should find a different story to tell. That's the first thing. Make sure there's an audience for your story. But 2, beyond that, is make sure you've got your script as good as it possibly can be, because without a good script, you're never going to make a good movie. And that might impact your chances of making a second or a third movie. And then make sure you have a good team around you. Make sure you're making it for the right price. Spending more doesn't mean it's going to be better. How can you get the most value on screen? How can you make your dollar go furthest? So that when people finally see it, you really have tried to do something that's honest, that means something to you, and that could also mean something to them. Persistence.
Thanks for that. That's awesome,
yeah,
Ali.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. That was great advice. I like the focus on teams because we've heard it in other conversations too, with budding and struggling entrepreneurs. So thank you for that, and good luck with all your future work.
Thank you. Yes, I need it. I always need it.
Thanks, Ali. Best of luck, Habibi.
This podcast is funded by a grant from the United States Department of State. The opinions, findings, and conclusions of this podcast are those of our guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the United States Department of State.